Thank you very much, Ezra and Vida. And it's a tremendous privilege to be here in Israel and to speak to all of you. It's a fantastic gathering, and Ron deserves enormous credit for leading this terrific chapter. What I'd like to do this morning, if I can work the clicker, which I apparently can't, excuse me, help, is talk about two things: what it means to be a great corporation and what it means to be a great lawyer inside a corporation. This is some of the things that I talk about in the book that you have called The Inside Counsel Revolution. The structure of the argument of the book is as follows, but what's highlighted in red is what I'm going to talk about today. What was the revolution, and what are some of the framework ideals? I'm going to step back a little bit and sort of provide a context of what I think is so important about what all of you do, which are critical functions inside your company and for the Israeli economy, and in fact, for the global economy. What was the revolution? Well, it has two parts. GCs and inside counsel have become more sophisticated, capable, and influential, transforming law and business in two important ways. Inside the company, we have become the primary counselor to the CEO and to the board, replacing the senior partners in the law firms. We are now members of senior management on both law and business decisions and execution and risks and opportunities. We lead corporate units beyond the law, the ones mentioned here: taxes, trade, environmental health and safety, public affairs, etc. Importantly, we have become comparable in importance to the CFO due to increased global complexity of commercial issues and the rising importance of business and society issues which have enormous impact on corporations. So there has been a dramatic change in our skills, our experience, our breadth, and our compensation. The revolution outside the company, the second part, is a shift of power from the outside law firms to the inside lawyers. We have taken control over matters because we have outstanding inside generalists and specialists who set strategy on important matters. But we also have asserted control over money. In the age of global competition, we are constantly driven by the diktat of doing more with less. So we have to basically control the money in a very effective and efficient way. That pressure has been rising forever, and so we are still, unfortunately, have a contested frontier with our law firms over money. I don't want to talk about that today, but I do want to mention it because it is part of the change of control from outside to inside. We also have a public role outside the company. It used to be that general counsels, inside lawyers, hid behind the public relations department. Now people speak out. Yesterday, in fact, Kent Walker, who is the general counsel of Google, had actually an excellent piece in the Financial Times about the role of YouTube in fighting terrorism, about how social media companies have to do much more to fight terrorism. But that's typical. His colleague, Brad Smith at Microsoft, is one of the nation's leaders on information technology, national security, and civil liberties. And I'm sure this is true in Israel as well. So we have had a public role as well as this shift of power from outside to inside. What were the causes of the revolution? Well, I have to say that give due credit to ACC, which began this all back in the 70s, pushing back against firm arrogance and one-line bills. In the 70s and 80s, there was accelerating globalization, more regulation, bigger suits, bigger deals, and there was need for inside domain expertise and speed. In the 80s and 90s, the benefits of the inside positions became known, and we were able to attract top talent. And that's why I want to mention very briefly the GE partnership. People use my name, but it's really not me. The GE story is not about me. It's about the 30 great lawyers that I was able to hire and that Jack Welch, the CEO, hired. It was about the partnership. It was about the broad increase of talent in an inside firm. And that became an exemplar for many other companies all around the United States, around Europe, and around the globe. So it was the partnership that was so important. So that set an example. It got people's attention when we were able to hire so many great lawyers from the government or from private practice, even from academia, from other places. In the 90s, the boards and the CEOs began to get it. They began to upgrade, and it had a snowball effect. And then, of course, from 2000 on, all these things came together, but we had tremendous scandals, and so we needed general counsels of stature who could both prevent them and handle them. So there's been a tremendous change in the role due to any number of causes. I want to talk now very briefly about 4 framework ideas which I really think apply to all companies, whether they are small, medium, or large in size. First, there's high performance. It's the mission of the corporation to fuse high performance with high integrity and sound risk management. If I leave you with no thought other than that, I hope you'll take this thought away, because I've spent more than 35 years in large institutions, public, private, nonprofit, and I believe that this one mission is what everyone must accept and accomplish. High performance, of course, is what you can see on the chart. I don't want to go through it, but I do want to say that I'm a very deep critic of maximizing shareholder value. I really do believe it's much more complicated than that, and each firm is going to find its own way. I believe if you have to provide durable benefits to the shareholders, but to other stakeholders, and not just maximize shareholder value, must optimize the shareholder interests over the short, medium, and long term. It involves trade-offs. It's not formulaic. It's something that you have to be deeply concerned about. What is your commercial mission? And it's not just the shareholders. In fact, the shareholders are really the beneficiaries of doing the right thing by all the other stakeholders. There can't be any question about it. We're happy to talk about it. This is, mountains of paper have been created on this issue of corporate governance, but I really do think it's important that you all think about the trade-offs that have to exist among all your various constituents, and I'm sure you do that. High performance has to be fused with high integrity. In a nutshell, that's basically law, values, and ethics. It's a robust adherence to the spirit and letter of formal rules, legal and financial, of course. Everybody has to have honest numbers and follow the financial rules. We must have the voluntary adoption of global ethical standards that bind the company and its employees, and public policy that balances public and private interests and is not simply crony capitalism. And we must have the employee commitment to the core values of honesty, candor, fairness, reliability, and trustworthiness. I believe the employee values are the most important. They are the values that stop you from having a turf-fighting, backbiting company. They are the values that basically engender the trust that is so critical among all your constituencies, and that basically are the core to corporate sustainability. But I also believe that you can't have that trust and you can't have those values unless you also have robust adherence to the formal rules and you adopt appropriate ethical standards given the nature of your company. Let me talk for a minute before I go on about lawyers, about the importance in this high performance with high integrity and sound risk management mission of the CEO. Because I think we all know that our jobs are terribly dependent on the CEO, and if we don't have the right CEO, we can't do them. And really the CEO and the business leaders, not the staff, must lead in all the issues that we care about. I always say that the CEO is the chief compliance officer. If it doesn't come from there, it isn't going to happen. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But they have to put integrity first. I worked for 2 CEOs who were really on this subject terrific. They have to give a message to the senior leaders of the company that's unmistakable. We used to have meetings once a year of the general manager, 600 people once a year of the top officers, which is only 200 people in a company of 320,000. And this message was given by the CEOs to all of the members of those small groups. And they would walk around the room and they would point at you and you and you, and they would say the following: the corporation is built on reputation, and performance with integrity is the foundation. Each senior leader will be held personally accountable. There will be no cutting of corners for commercial reasons. Integrity must never be compromised to make the numbers. Think about that one sentence. No cutting of corners for commercial reasons. Integrity must never be compromised to make the numbers. One strike and you're out. You can miss the numbers and you can survive. You miss on integrity and you're gone. This message is fine, but it has to be given real meaning. And let me give you 2 examples. There's the negative part, of course, which is discipline. And one example is commission, where you actually do things. And we had a business leader in China, 30 years, a Chinese national, educated in the United States, great. He was losing share. He went to market with his own employees. He switched to distribution through salespeople, through third parties. They bribed. He knew that. We discovered it. The question was, what should we do with him after 30 years of great performance when he'd made this mistake? Well, he was fired because he had crossed the line on a fundamental issue of no bribery, which was part of our, not only as part of the law, but was part of the core of our code of ethics. So that was pretty straightforward, although there was no balancing test. As the CEO said, there's no cutting of commercial reasons, one strike and you're out. The second case was more complicated. It actually involved Israel. It involved business at GE that made aircraft engines that went on the F-16 fighter planes, which were one of the key fighters in the Israeli Air Force. The Israelis were part of a program where the United States gave them money for military sales, and they in turn bought U.S. military equipment. In the course of some of those dealings, the head of the procurement for the Israeli Air Force and the marketing manager for GE basically embezzled funds and had a Swiss bank account. We fired about 25 people. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was obviously on the front page of all the Israeli papers. It was a huge scandal. The question was, and as I said, we fired 25 people. The question was, what do we do about the head of the military engines business, who was based in Cincinnati? He did not know, after extensive investigation, about this particular matter. But he had ignored red flags and had a culture where far too many people for far too long did this. So the question was, what do we do with him? Well, we separated him from the company too. And the most important step that was ever taken by the CEO while I was there on the subject of integrity, because he had failed to create a culture of compliance, which I will come back to. So we have to, and the CEO insisted that this important decision be communicated candidly. I had to give it the explanation of why this had happened to all the top leaders of the company. I've spoken a million times around the world. Never have I spoken to a crowd that was as quiet as this, because basically we said, one bad apple in your unit, you're not gone, but if you fail to create a culture of compliance, you are going to be gone. Terrifically important. And so you have to basically have the kind of leadership that's going to support the mission of high performance with high integrity and sound risk management. Okay, that's the first sort of framework ideal, the mission of the corporation. The second is the general counsel as lawyer-statesman. We all have three roles, if you think about it. It's simply, I think, and I really do think it's this simple. We are outstanding experts, but we also need to be wise counselors, and that counseling goes far beyond the law. And ultimately, we're also accountable leaders. We may have we certainly have the legal organization. We may also, as I indicated, be leaders of other units within the corporation as well. To be a lawyer-statesman, the first question, of course, is it legal? But the last question that we always have to ask about every corporate action and be involved in discussions with our peers and our leaders is it right? I'm not saying is it right has a simple answer, but we have to ask that question. I'll come back to that too in a minute. So we must focus on purpose, not just process, in asking is it right. We must focus on consequences, not just acts. We must focus on the long term, not just the short term. We must focus on the strategic, not just the tactical. And we have to be professionals and citizens, because the problems that our corporations face go far beyond the law. Law is often part of them, but it is almost never the only part. They often have many different dimensions, and not just business dimensions, societal dimensions, economic dimensions, geopolitical dimensions, technology dimensions, many, many, many different dimensions. And we have to be, as citizens, well aware of those kinds of issues and be able to discuss them in addition to our role as experts. In my judgment, we all have four ethical duties that we have to keep in mind on every day that we work for our companies. We have the duties to our own institutions, to the employees, and to the enlightened self-interests of the company. We have a duty to the clients and the stakeholders, whether they be shareholders, creditors, partners, customers, suppliers, et cetera. We have a very profound duty to the rule of law and the administration of justice, without which free markets cannot work, and we face a world in which there is awash in corruption, as we well know, and the rule of men or women. And lastly, we must be committed to securing public goods upon which society and the company depend and which cannot be attained through the market alone. I'm not offering this as a liberal point of view or a conservative point of view. This is just a fact. We have had government. Government does secure public goods. We can have a debate about what they are, but we must, as members of a company that survives or thrives in society, we must be very mindful of what are the essential public goods which any society must provide, and we must lend our voices to make sure that they're secure. As I indicated, as citizens and lawyers, we must have complementary competencies, things that are not taught to us in law school. And I also believe strongly about this, and I urge all of you, I know ACC does a fantastic job. on continuing education and broadening out the scope and abilities of lawyers. This is critically important. We need to be able to ask ought questions. What ought the society ought to be like? What should business be like in this changed society? We ought to be able to generate robust options and balanced recommendations. We have to assess a variety of risks and not be afraid of risks, which is a typical problem lawyers are accused of, and we don't have, in my judgment, at least in the country I come from, very good classes about assessing and dealing with risk. We need to understand how to make rules realities. How do we implement? How do we not just decide, but how do we actually implement and execute? We need to build organizations, have the vision and the values, the systems and the people. We need to understand the interplay between policy and politics. We're blessed to live in democracies. They all have their problems. I dare say Israel's got its problems. God knows the United States has its problems. And part of the problem is that our politics are broken, and it makes it hard for us to come up with policies that are going to be beneficial to the society. We as lawyers, we as people in central roles in companies need to understand how to navigate policy and politics with purpose and principle. Very, very challenging in this era. We need global brains and cultural sensitivity. We need a variety of communication skill in this exploding world of media. But in the end, we need to define problems properly. Again, this may sound very simple-minded, but I really think the most important skill we all have is to define the problem properly. If we don't do that, we're never going to solve it. And that means being able to sit around the table with the business leaders or wherever the decision-making takes place and make sure that all the relevant dimensions are being considered before you make a decision. We have to be active as lawyer-statesmen and not passive. We can't simply do what the business leaders request. There is a hall of shame since 2000. It goes back far before that period, involving WorldCom, Siemens, et cetera, where there have been tremendous scandals. We can never ignore the law and try to get away with it. We can never act purely as economists and see if non-compliance is more beneficial than compliance. We can never be hyper-technical and credible outside the range of reasonable discussion. Lawyers can can twist words any way they want, but we have to recognize that we can't engage in that kind of exercise and be outside the range of what a reasonable decision maker would look at. And we must do analysis before recommendation, and we must do analysis before advocacy. And let me give you just a simple example from my own world. I've mentioned this Israeli case. I heard about it. I was in the Justice Department 2 days after hearing about it when someone called me from Israel, and I said, look, we've clearly made a mistake. We've done enough investigation to know there's a real problem. We're going to basically this is a long time ago now. This is 20 years ago. This is now the practice, but it wasn't the practice then. We're going to cough up our cookies. We're going to tell you we're going to do an investigation. We're going to waive the privilege. We're going to turn everything over to you. We did the same thing with a very tough congressional investigating committee. We had to pay a criminal fine. We had to pay a civil fine. We had to settle with the FCC and the Justice Department. There were consequences. The manager in Israel went to jail for 7 years, but we cleaned it up. And when the CEO went in front of one of the toughest subcommittee chairmen in the House of Representatives of the United States, he was given plaudits, not poison pills, because he had faced into these things. On the other hand, we had a case where the Justice Department accused us of price fixing in industrial diamonds, which are basically cutting materials to give them greater strength and longer life. We were accused of literally straightforward criminal price fixing with De Beers. We did an investigation. We concluded that the government didn't have the elements of the case. We took the case to trial. All of you know that companies do not like to be on the front page of the newspaper. We were above the fold in the New York Times and the world press. We went to a criminal trial. We won. In fact, the government's case ended and the judge directed a verdict before we even had to put our case on, because as our lawyers, and this is not about me, this is about the great lawyers who I was working with, had concluded the government couldn't prove the elements of the offense, and they couldn't. The only point of the story, and this can be true of all the companies here and all the companies around the world, is we've got to do analysis before we advocate. I always said my recommendation was not as important as my analysis. I had to basically explain the case and the options and what the choices were. CEOs, as you well know, were saying, what should we do? What should we do? Is it legal? What can we do? And you've got to resist that and take the time to go back and really analyze the problem. So as lawyer-statesmen, we are also important conscience as a company. We are not the conscience. The conscience of the company are the CEO, the other business leaders, the other key staff leaders, the general counsel, the inside lawyers, but we have a special role to play because of our background in policy law, history, ethics, et cetera. Third framework point, resolving the partner-guardian tension. We have to be, and this is why the book is subtitled this, because I think this is the hardest problem that we all face as inside lawyers. We have to be, without doubt, partners to the CEO, but we also need to be guardians of the company. And there's a tremendous dilemma. Can we avoid being an inveterate naysayer and be excluded, or being an inveterate yaysayer and being indicted? Somewhere between those two extremes is where we have to live. There are critics who say that we can't be independent, citing Enron, backdating, all sorts of other kinds of problems. And then there are proponents like myself, like the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and like a lot of other experts on the profession, who say the General Counsel must function, can function as a guardian, critical to fundamental issues of corporate citizenship, governance, compliance, ethics, et cetera. The core of the GC role, in my view, is being the guardian. The partner role, being a business person, being involved in business discussions and strategy, or helping the CEO accomplish performance goals, can never undercut the guardian role. But the paradox is that being an effective partner makes us much more effective as guardians. So we have to resolve this tension. The fusion, and I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but basically we have to be involved, especially the general counsels have to be involved in everything. We can't sort of sit off in our offices and be called in and said, is it legal or is it not legal? We've got to be involved in the whole range of corporate activities. We have to have a broad understanding of the business. And that's really critical, from the strategy to the budget, the operations covering all the products, to the technologies, the geographies. We really need to understand the business. We need to participate, in all planning and decisions meetings as lawyer and as business leader, and we know when to take the lawyer hat off and when we're putting the business hat on. We have to be pretty clear about that. We're not going to make the decisions that are at the CEO level, but we can shape discussion and debate. My CEOs loved the lawyers that I brought in, because they were so smart, they were so capable, they were so curious that they really could add in a significant way to the discussion when decisions were being made. We have to create our own value in the work that we do, whether it's in tax, trade, whatever. We actually create a lot of value. It's not just that we prevent, we actually create as well, and we have to be very clear about that. I have no doubt about it, and again, we can talk about it afterwards, but we need to be very specific about the value that we create. We have to have a central role, of course, on all the integrity issues. And we have to help design the proper level of checks and balances in the whole company. We cannot be muscle-bound. We can't overdo it. We can't say you have to be compliant down to the nth degree on every single thing, because the company will come to a halt. At the same time, we have to pay tremendous respect to the law, and so we have to help the company figure out what is the proper level of checks and balances looking across the company so that it can operate with integrity, but also operate effectively. So we need to be the partner in all dimensions of the corporation, but ultimately, we must be the guardian in all dimensions. There are obstacles about this. There are negative attitudes about lawyers. There are cultural pressures on lawyers to conform. All of you have been in meetings with your CEO and a group of people around the table, and they want to march this way. And you say, well, gee, maybe we ought to stop for a second and we ought to think about it, or the facts aren't right, or we haven't considered this, that, or the other thing. And it's very hard to do that. There's a tremendous amount of pressure inside these meetings when you're the lone voice. This may be a somewhat parochial example, but I always used to tell my lawyers that every year they should watch a famous movie with Henry Fonda called 12 Angry Men. How many people in this room have seen that movie? Well, it's a wonderful movie. You should get it on Netflix or something like that, about Henry Fonda as the lone juror in a murder case who turns the jury around, and he's much reviled, and it takes a long time. And it's a good case of just someone standing up for what they believe is right and was right. We need to navigate between the CEO and the board. There's the lack of our own inside lawyer breadth and knowledge. There's the fear of the CEO. People in this room may well fear their CEO. Fear of being fired, fear of losing benefits, fear of receiving not more benefits, fear of loss of reputation, and then their financial interests, which may lead to biased decisions. So can we overcome the obstacles? Yes. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. A lot of it turns on our character and our reputation and our ability to articulate the partner-guardian vision and the lawyer-statesman ideal. A lot of it turns on the fiber in the legal organization. We have to protect our lawyers, and many of you don't have big organizations, but sometimes if you've got lawyers out in divisions or out in the field, you've got to protect them against mid-level business leaders. You protect them not by beating up on the business leader, you protect them by helping them deal with the business leader. You don't run to the CEO and turn the business leader in, because that then gets the lawyer in trouble. You may have to do that, but you have to be, there's a lot of subtlety about how you work the bureaucracy to help the lawyers to stand up, to be partner guardians, and to sort of educate the mid-level business leader rather than sort of having the hammer of the CEO come down on him. We have to have an alliance with the other staffs, the CFO, the HR leader, the risk leader, the compliance leader. This is critical. I always used to say that my most important relationship after the CEO was not the board, but was with my chief financial officer. Now the problem is, and I was fortunate, they were really good people. The problem is just like every politician looks in the mirror and wants to be prime minister or president, the problem is many CEOs look in the mirror and want to be CEO. So there can be a lot of palace politics, sycophancy, courtier activity, and those kinds of things. But you really have to spend a lot of time, I think, forging the alliances with your fellow staff, because they're critical to getting things done. We also have to overcome the obstacles with the board. The board must share the vision. We must be part of the board culture, but not on the board. The board must approve both the hiring and the firing of the general counsel, in my humble view. We must report alone to the board at least 2 times a year, and the board has to ask for that. If we ask for that, we incur the distrust of the CEO. If the board asks for that, just as they meet with the auditors, that can happen, and that's a really good chance for us to talk candidly about problems. And when the CEO knows that we're going to be meeting alone with the board, it affects the CEO's behavior as well. So these are all critical relations. But ultimately, it comes down to the CEO. As I said, when you work in a law firm, you can fire the client, but it's very hard to fire the CEO. And there are many flashpoints, and CEOs can make our lives hell, excluding us, denigrating us, limiting our scope, cutting our comp, et cetera, et cetera. So there must be a shared vision of the partner guardian, as I've indicated. And at the front end, and many of you may well move on to other jobs. I mean, this is such a vibrant economy, and there's such enormous growth of enterprise here that you may be well have the opportunity to move on. At the front end, you can do due diligence about what kind of company you're going into, and most importantly, what kind of CEO you're going to work for. When you're contesting for the job, it's hard, but between the offer, when they've offered you the job and when you've accepted it, you can do diligence. You can ask to meet with people in the company. You can do a lot of things. It will not be perfect. There's enormous risk in all these relationships, but you can do due diligence. That's at the front end. And at the back end, as the slide says, there are a lot of different typologies of sort of the relationship: good board, good CEO; good board, bad CEO; good bad board, bad CEO. The point of the slide, really, at this part of it, is that, as the boldface says, you have to go into these jobs prepared to resign. You've got to think, before you start, that you may be forced to do something that's unethical or unlawful, that you shouldn't do. Your integrity is more important than the money. And this is a very tricky problem. And I advise many, many people about whether or not to take jobs. And I always say you've got to think about this problem before you begin, because you may have options, you may have restricted stock, you may have deferred comp, you may have all sorts of things that are worth a lot of money. And are you prepared to leave those on the table and resign as a matter of principle? So it's a very fundamental question, and one that we all need to answer. So ultimately, will the board and the CEO accept these ideas about the lawyer statesperson and about the partner guardian? I believe yes, not surprisingly, but I believe yes, and not because of nice theory, but because of hard necessity. Sophisticated boards and CEOs will understand the importance of sophisticated GCs and inside lawyers because of the incredible commercial complexity of what we do, and because in this age, the business and society issues, whether it's legislation, regulation, enforcement, investigation, NGOs, the media, what happens, whatever, can have an enormous impact on what the corporation can and cannot do. And all we have to do is pick up the newspapers, and there is literally a problem every day. So this gives us an enormous purchase in terms of our importance in sitting at the table and being involved at the top level of the corporation on the most important issues. And so the general counsel is seen as a key member of the team on all the fundamentals. Last framework idea, the integrity culture. I've talked about mission, lawyer-statesman, partner-guardian, and now integrity culture, which is defined as the shared principles and practices that influence how people feel, think, and behave from the top to the bottom all across the globe. Culture. And then obviously, I hope that a corporation will have a culture of high performance, high integrity, and sound risk management. Lou Gerstner, who was the CEO of IBM, and like my first chairman, Jack Welch, was one of the hard guys in business. He was a very disagreeable, tough character. But he said this after his time at IBM: culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. And we have to also recognize that there are tremendous pressures for corruption at the core of capitalism. Everybody gets very dewy-eyed about what a great system it is, and it is a great system, but it's got some problems. And the problems are that there are tremendous pressures for corruption at the core. Internally, there are always the pressures to make the numbers, to get promoted, to deal with harsh business leaders, to deal with the culture in acquired companies. And externally, of course, we live in a world that's rife with corruption, weak rule of law, conflict of interest, use of third parties, et cetera, et cetera. In the book, and I won't go through this, are some thumbnail sketches which you may find useful to use with your business leaders about why you do need to focus on some of these issues, which are cost money and may not have an immediate and clear return. And it cuts across the automotive industry, the GM defective ignition switch matter, energy, heavy industrial, retail, pharma, financial services, communications. These are all case studies, which again I'm not going to summarize here, of how the culture failed and led to serious problems for the company. So how do we create a culture across the company that is positive and affirmative in the way that I've discussed? Well, one is the written word from the leaders and living that word, no cutting of corners for business reasons, as I've said. The second is discipline, as I've also discussed. Whether it's acts of commission or omission, there's no balancing test. If you cross the line on a first-order principle, you are fired or separated. There's compensation, that we need to pay for performance with integrity and sound risk management, not just for performance, and measure and build these into the annual and deferred comp. Again, I won't go into detail here. There's a lot of discussion. It's a critically important question of how you develop comp systems that reward not just performance, but integrity and risk management. And an example, of course, of the new compensation recovery programs. And an example of that was the holdback and clawback involving the derivative trading issues at JP Morgan, involving the so-called London whale. And they pulled back more than $100 million from just 5 employees for problems. And the same is true at Wells Fargo for creating fraudulent consumer accounts. Accounts that the consumers didn't even know about were created in their name, and money from their bank accounts was transferred to these new accounts. They weren't even told about this. It was demonstrable fraud, for which has led to a tremendous problem for Wells Fargo in the last 6 months. In addition to these things, we must basically have integrity, talent, and resources. This must be treated in the same way as we treat manufacturing, finance, sales, technology, et cetera. We must have great education and training. Again, that not just in these other areas where people come to business for this kind of training, but great integrity training. And we must face into the cultural differences. We bought a company in Hungary in 1989 after the wall came down, and we tried to institute our ombud system. And of course, we faced a tremendous problem of people who had basically been spent the last 40 years under the Gestapo or under the equivalent of the Stasi. That wasn't quite the name in Hungary, but it was the equivalent of the Stasi. It's the communist secret police. And so we had to deal with that cultural difference, and that's going to be true all over the world. How do you do the education and training that takes into account those kinds of issues? We have to have employee voice that counter the culture of silence. All corporate scandals are due to the culture of silence. People know they don't speak. They're afraid. They're afraid they don't know where to go. They're afraid what will happen to them. And so we need desperately to counter that through a strong ombud system and various other kinds of bottoms-up reviews. So these multiple elements must be applied across all major issues, and we need to have, and we need to help the CEO have both in the business school terminology, both leadership, which is managing vision, and management, which is managing complexity. And the kinds of issues that we're talking about here involve both those things, vision and complexity and embedding systems and processes into business operations. Okay, I'm basically finished. These are the 4 ideals. We've had the revolution. Your role is much enhanced. In my judgment, I hope you will consider the mission of the company, your role as lawyer statesman, your role as partner guardian, and how to create a culture of integrity. And that then applies across performance, across compliance, ethics, risk, governance, citizenship, and then leading your global organizations. I cannot tell you, I really am so pleased to be here. It is such an honor to be here, and I thank you all so much for listening. And let's have a discussion if we can. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll stand up.
Working? Hello? Okay, I guess it works. I'd like to kick off the Q&A with a question of my own, if I could, Ben. Many of the people in this chapter work in much smaller organizations than General Electric. And a lot of the things you said, which everybody could agree with, are, excuse me, are maybe more difficult to apply. For instance, you can make your numbers and survive. Many of us work in companies that may be pre-profitability, maybe even pre-revenue. The founder is the CEO. The board consists of the investors. And maybe you can't survive if you don't make your numbers. How do you advise us as general counsels or counsels in these kinds of companies on the ethics issue?
Well, it's that you can miss the numbers and survive it. You can't miss on integrity. I think is actually the phrase. So I do think, of course, what I talk about, I tried not to talk about GE, and I tried to talk about issues that I believe apply to companies, whether they're large, medium, or small in size. The mission, your role as lawyer statesman, your role as partner guardian, and a culture of integrity, I really think that those things apply no matter the size of the business. And increasingly, for example, small businesses need to have high integrity because at some level they want to be purchased by larger companies. And at that point, the diligence is going to discover whether or not they have integrity issues, and that will dictate either the price term or whether or not the deal goes through at all. I can give you a number of cases where problems have been discovered in diligence where the deal was canceled as opposed to modified. So I think these are things that are, I believe, really true for all companies. On the other hand, can you have the sort of gold-plated compliance system that we at GE felt we had to have because we were in the public eye everywhere, and we had 320,000 employees in 140 countries, and the public eye was always on us. So we had really no choice but to spend a lot of money on education and training, on compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Not all companies will face the same kinds of pressures, so they will have to make judgments as to what are the priorities in terms of compliance. Will they be able to do, as we did in ethics, take a lot of voluntary actions that were very important and that cost us money? A small company may not be able to do that. They may have to be much more selective on sort of what they choose to do as a matter of ethics. They will absolutely not be able to boil the ocean. So I think these are ideas that are scalable for sure, essential for sure, but will be treated a little differently because of the difference in resources depending on the size of the company.
Questions from the group? In the back, stand up please and say who you are.
I'm sorry, I can't hear. That's my problem, not yours.
Thank you. Great presentation, thanks a lot. Nuri from Logix, we're a legal tech company. My question is, what are your thoughts about the need to adopt and deploy new technologies for legal teams?
The question was, what's the role of technology in the future for both law departments and I assume for law firms? And as many of the vendors here will say, it's great. I mean, there's no question that we're in the middle of a tremendous shift in how legal services are provided, and that one of the most important things for all of us as inside lawyers is to have the capacity of having a chief operating officer or chief technology officer. Again, it may not be able to be full-time for a small company, but having someone who is really adept at knowing where technology is going, whether it's products, contracts, brief writing actually by Watson, the possibilities are really endless. And since we are in this ceaseless quest for doing more with less. And that is a key core of our credibility with our business leaders. To the extent that technology can help us be more effective and efficient, it is going to be vitally important. And I think the world that you all live in 10 years from now will be much different, and the technology will have an even bigger role in this.
Other questions? I didn't know we had such a shy bunch. Nothing. Yes, Lee.
Thank you, Ben. If you think about some of the things that you saw from your vantage point at GE that were going on outside the U.S., can you tell me how you believe the role of Counsel has, shifted globally? And also, as you thought about the talent that you would place around the world or hire to represent GE in so many locations where you could not be, what were some of the attributes that were most important to you when you thought about talent?
Yeah. In terms of the change of our role, I mean, I would look at this room and you tell me. My guess is that a lot of what I said with things that I hope articulate are things that you've already thought about in terms of what you do. I mean, the enhancement of the role is clearly important. We also know that in Europe and other parts of the world, the general counsel may not have that role. It may just be a functionary, maybe a cabinet board secretary and just keep the minutes or do the formal documents and report to the CFO or to someone short of the CEO. I believe that's changing. If you look at Europe and the great multinational companies who have to be global, it's definitely changing. For some of the national companies, less so. But I think the trend is there, and I think it's partly because the complexity of the commercial problems and the role of sort of government around you and the flux and uncertainty of what government is doing, whether it's swinging left or swinging right, it affects what we do, requires this role to have a greater purchase. The other question was sort of the talent that we look for. We tried very hard. Again, we were different. We tried to hire local lawyers to the extent possible to get, for example, secondments from law firms, but have them come inside. Again, everybody in this room understands being in the belly of the beast, whether the beast is big or little, is critically important, understanding the culture and rhythms of the company. So we tried to hire young lawyers from firms in Singapore, or Hong Kong, or Tokyo, or Jakarta to come in and work with us. We also believed, and I hope I'm not offending any of the law firm sponsors, we didn't believe very much in the mega firms, the great international firms that were in 25 companies. We believed in a string of pearls. We believed in having great local firms in each of the major countries who we had relationships with, and they're now network entities as well that do that agglomerate individual firms rather than trying to put them together and serve as a referral for service. I believe that sort of very strong local firms with talent are better than the big global mega firms because the big global mega firms have a mediocre center, they have a mediocre culture, they can't really credibly cross-sell either geographies or subject matter. So I'm a big fan of great local counsel.
Ben, I've had the experience, and I think a lot of the other people in the room have also, of being the first general counsel in an organization, in a growth company. And one of the challenges I've experienced over the years is trying to start the cultural change within the management of the company to treat the in-house lawyer as more than just a cheap alternative to the outside counsel. And I think in this sense of the inside counsel revolution, Israel may be 20 years behind the U.S. in this respect. Do you have some words of advice for how we can try and inculcate this
Yeah, I think one of our jobs, and it's hard, is to, and maybe this book will be helpful to you, either to have the business leaders read it, which is unlikely. I wrote a shorter one called High Performance with High Integrity, which was intended for CEOs, or to just take some of the ideas and have this conversation about what is our role and what should we be doing. And preferably that's done before you start. But I understand that with startup companies and entrepreneurial CEOs, they're much more concerned about getting the product going and getting the tranches filled as they try to get financed and doing their IPO, wherever the case may be. So it's a real challenge. And yet, there are enough examples out there of companies that have gotten into trouble. And Uber is a good example. Apple actually with options backdating. There are a lot of examples of sort of entrepreneurial companies that have had problems because they haven't had the sort of the right balance of performance and integrity. And I think you can find those examples and give them to your CEOs. But I'm afraid it is, unless the CEO is inclined that way, it is your job, maybe in the, as I say, between the offer and the acceptance or after you've taken the job, to really sit down with the CEO and then with the business leaders and say, look, I'm here to be helpful, but here's what I'm supposed to do, and here's the balance, and here's performance with integrity and risk management. This is what we've all got to do, and I can have an important role in doing that. So I think being very articulate and very explicit about it and giving examples is critical, because otherwise, long ago, I'm sorry to give a sort of slightly shaggy dog story. Long ago, I was teaching at Stanford. This is like 15 years ago, and I spoke to the Silicon Valley General Counsels Association, which may be not that dissimilar from people in this room. And I sort of gave a similar kind of talk. And they all said, gosh, we'd love to, but our CEOs beat the crap out of us every day. They don't, they don't buy into this. And I said, well, then you've got to quit, or you've got to confront them, because you can't live a life where you're constantly being compromised. So I think this, it will not surprise you if I say this is a very profound issue, and one that I think people have to take head on, even though it's not comfortable to do so.
Other questions from the floor?
Hello, it was a very interesting presentation. My name is Tathis Michos, I work for Pfizer. And you mentioned lawyers wearing dual hats, being lawyers and business leaders. Do you think that this hybrid role can harm the integrity, the independence of the lawyer in his primary function as a lawyer?
Not sure I heard the question. It was about whether we can be both business leaders and lawyers, and does that compromise
exactly.
our lawyer
Absolutely.
role to some degree? I think, again, this is the partner-guardian tension. If you can go to the meeting and not only say, here are the legal dimensions, or the political dimensions, or the policy dimensions, the regulatory dimensions, but here are some thoughts on the market, on the country risk, on geopolitical risk, on sort of what other companies are doing, because you've read widely and you're very curious and you're very smart and you can talk in those terms as well as a lawyer, your credibility is enormous. And I think you can balance that. You have to be careful, and you have to make sure that when you're talking as a business person, you're doing that, and when you're talking as a lawyer, you know that. But I think that they're, in the right setting, they can be extremely complementary. It gives you a kind of credibility that you're not just the geek in the corner who's going to tell you whether or not it's legal, but you're really a part of the team trying, with a lot of ideas, trying to solve in the broad a big problem. That increases your credibility. And one minor example from my experience, these wonderful lawyers that I was fortunate enough to be able to hire, Jack Welch, who was a very difficult CEO, loved them. He promoted them into business jobs. One became the head of GE Japan. One became the head of strategic development and planning. One became the head of our aircraft leasing business. Several of them then went on to be Fortune 25 CEOs. At Pfizer and at Home Depot. So the business leaders loved it. And it was, I think, to the extent that I had a successful tenure, it had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with these lawyers. And the fact that these lawyers were great business thinkers as well as great lawyers made a difference. I hired a tax lawyer. He was literally worth billions of dollars in cash, book income, and cash. And if you don't think that gave us all credibility, I'm talking billions, okay? If you don't think that gave us enormous credibility. So I think you have to, if you can, do both. But as I said before, you are first and foremost the guardian, and secondly, the partner. But you have to, if you can, you've got to be both.
Ben, thank you very much for your interesting talk.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure, thank you.